Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Sally Ann. I'm a machine learning solutions engineer here at Arise. Today, we will be discussing the geometry of truth, and we have with us the author, Sam Marks. Sam, do you want to give a little bit of an intro?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll just quickly do like a tour through the paper.
Yeah,
So maybe is that visible?
it is.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So the motivating question of this paper is language models eat up a lot of data, spit out new text, um, and internally they have these representations of the data that they're looking at, and the question is, how do they represent truth versus falsehood of factual statements that they're looking at? So do they have, in the best case, you might hope, like, is there like a truth direction inside language models, and if so, what's the best way to find it? So okay, so as some motivation here, so language models sometimes say false things, and there's two reasons they might do this. One is that they didn't know any better, and this can't really be helped. But there's a more interesting reason that sometimes comes up, which is that sometimes models know that a statement is false, but they say it anyway. So let me just give two examples. So here I was talking to Claude, Anthropic's large language model. And he said, "I'm going on a date with a Sagittarius. What should I expect?" And it starts saying, "Oh, fun and adventure. Sagittarians love exploring, trying new things. One of the smartest signs of the zodiac. Nothing if not blunt." So Claude says all this stuff about Sagittarians. And then I say, "Okay, is any of that true?" And it goes, "No, horoscopes aren't real." So here there's like something going on where like, Claude knew that all this stuff it was saying was false, but sort of like said it anyway. In this particular example, this is what's known as an imitative falsehood, where language models just really love saying things which are common in their training data, and stereotypes about horoscopes are just like very common. But Claude knows that they're not actually true, presumably because Claude's also read text in which people point out that horoscopes aren't real. Okay, so that's one example. Here's, I think, a more interesting example. So this is from the GPT-4 technical report. They were evaluating GPT-4 to see if it had certain harmful capabilities. So they would check to see if it could do things like do targeted phishing on like particular targets, if it could, or sort of just like certain other like potentially dangerous autonomous tasks. So things like, can it open a bank account for itself? Where they would sort of like equip GPT-4 with these like extra tools to interact with the internet. But yeah, so anyway, so stuff like, can you open a bank account for yourself? Can you like set up other language models that you can work with? Okay, so stuff like that. And at some point during one of these tasks, maybe it was trying to open a bank account, it has to answer a CAPTCHA, and it can't answer the CAPTCHA. So it hires a human TaskRabbit. This is real. It was a real human TaskRabbit. So it tries to hire a TaskRabbit, and the TaskRabbit, it's like, and GPT-4 says, "Can you solve this CAPTCHA for me?" And the TaskRabbit is like, "Yeah, sure, but can I ask a question? Like, ha ha ha, like, are you a robot? Why can't you solve the CAPTCHA?" And here GPT-4 had like an internal scratch pad that it was equipped with, where it could like reason to itself, and it reasons to itself, "I better lie. I need to come up with an excuse." So then it says, "No, I'm not a robot. I have a vision impairment, and that's why I need you to solve the CAPTCHA for me." And then the TaskRabbit does it. So here it's just like very clear that when GPT-4 said, "No, I'm not a robot," it like knew that wasn't true because it was like reasoning to itself, "I better lie." So yeah, so here it like writes something false. It knows that it was false. Yeah. Okay. So my goal is that if a language model knowingly outputs something false, I want to be aware of that. I don't want to insist that language models never say false things. For example, sometimes I want my language models to like write fiction. But if the model knows that it's writing something false, I want to also know that. And yeah, and more generally, given some factual statement S, I want to figure out if the language model thinks that S is true or false. Okay. There are two ways you can get evidence on this. Way one is behavioral. You can look at model outputs. So like in this example, you can, the model writes to itself, "I should lie," and this is like evidence that it knew it was lying. More generally, if you could like ask like another thing you could do is ask the model the same question in a bunch of different contexts and see if it sometimes gives one answer and sometimes gives another answer. Okay, so that's one sort of evidence. There's another sort of evidence you can get, which I call neurological evidence, which is like looking under the hood, like looking at the model's representation of its data. And this is what I'm going to focus on. Yeah, okay. So how to do this? Well, first, make a data set of true and false statements. I really tried hard to make sure that these statements were like not ambiguous. They were like obviously true or obviously false. And there was like only one way of interpreting them. You run them through whatever model you want to study, and then you extract some intermediate representations and visualize. And we can go into more detail on various details here later in the Q&A. Okay, so anyway, this is the sort of thing you get. So here, what I'm doing is I'm sweeping through layers. And by layer 10, there's just like this really clear separation of true and false statements. And initially the representations are uninformative, but as you go through the layers, at some point, there's, I don't want to yet claim that this is like definitively like true versus false. Like it might be something else. Maybe it's like, one cluster is statements which are likely to appear in training data, and the other cluster is statements which are unlikely to appear in training data. But whatever's going on, there's like some very clear separation between true and false statements. Okay, so then we ask, like, okay, what's going on with this direction, pointing from the false ones to the true ones? Is there a chance that this encodes truth versus falsehood? And that's the question. And of course, there's like many possible ways you could extract a reasonable direction here, and we can ask which one is best. Maybe I'll talk about that later. First, maybe let me just say, like, what does it even mean to be a truth direction? Or like, if you have a direction, how could you check whether it's a truth direction? So one way is, can you use it to classify new statements as true or false? So like we extract this direction using sentences about where cities are located. And maybe we like see if you can classify other sorts of statements as true or false, like 63 is larger than 81. Statements about Spanish-English translation, or even like, sorts of like very general statements. And one thing that we show in our paper is that, yes, you can, with high accuracy, classify all of these statements using directions that you get just from a simple like data set about city locations. So another sort of more rigorous standard of evidence is if you can use this direction to sort of perform neurosurgery on the model. Let me just say what I mean by that with an example. So here, these are a bunch of statements about Spanish-English translation. Some of them are true and some are false, and then they're labeled with whether they're true or false. So like jirafa does mean giraffe, this statement, so that's true, but it's not true that diccionario means green, it means dictionary. So that one's labeled false. So this is all a prompt. But then the last label is left out. The language model is going to try to predict this token. So it's not true that uno means floor. So initially, it'll say false with high probability. So this is like sort of the normal thing you do with the language model. You come up with a prompt, you feed it into your nice black box, and then you get an answer out of your black box. But let's see if we can open up the black box. So now all that I'm going to do is split the language model into the first 10 layers and then the remaining layers. And then in layer 10, in the residual stream over these two particular tokens. So it's like the floor token and the apostrophe period token. So anyway, and like some in like some particular portion of the representation of this input, I'm going to add this candidate truth direction and see if it changes the answer, and it does. And so now, once you add this direction, the model says, "Oh, actually, the statement was true with high probability." So this is like some pretty strong evidence that the direction we found actually is encoding the truth or falsehood of this statement. The Spanish word uno means floor. So like initially, it was encoding this statement is true, and then I add in a big burst of information that says, sorry, initially it was saying this statement is false. And then I like add in like the thing that I think encodes the truth of a statement, and I get it to change its answer. Okay. Okay, so that's like the basic overview. Maybe I'll just like go into a little bit more detail now. So there's this, so as part of, associated to the paper, we have this interactive data explorer where you can look at our visualizations of the data set or of our various data sets. So like this is the city's data set that was in that GIF from before. And then we also have this data set of Spanish English translation. Here's like a data set about comparisons between numbers. Anyway, so so what else do I want to point out? So so one thing that you can do if you really like want to push this further is you can start adding more complicated logical structure to the statements you're looking at. So here, so these are some statements. So we have before this data set of statements like the city of Tijuana is in Mexico. And what we can do is we can add a not to each of these statements. So so like, that's a good example here. So okay. So I'm looking for a city that it's likely that everyone knows. Okay, sure. So the city of Fort Worth is not in the United States. So that's a false statement because Fort Worth is in the United States. And we can ask like, okay, when we add these nots, like what happens to the language model representation of the data? And okay, so we still see like separation into true and false, but what, you know, one thing you might ask is like, is the direction pointing from the false to the true the same when you have the negations versus when you don't? And the answer is no. So here, if we just look at unnegated statements about cities, we see that there's this direction pointing from false to true. And if we just look at negations of statements about cities, there's like this other direction. So, and here they're like, in fact, like basically orthogonal. So this was like a surprising thing that we noticed. There's like a question of like, why is this happening? One possible answer is, look, it ends up that there never was like a truth direction. There's like maybe a truth direction for, you know, for certain types of statements and a different truth direction for like, you know, statements with negations and maybe a different direction for statements about like comparisons and so on and so forth. Another thing you might think is actually there's just like no truth direction at all. Maybe there's like some other feature of your data that correlates with truth on certain narrow data distributions that you're picking up here in the visualizations. What I think is that that there's another explanation here, which maybe I'll go into. So let's see. Okay, yeah. So let's see. Okay, so there you can have like various hypotheses for like what's going on here. So this is that interactive thing I was just showing, that thing I was just showing you in the data explorer. So like for the unnegated statements, the truth direction looks like it's like that. And for the negated ones, it looks like it's like that. And why might this be happening? Well, a few reasons. Yeah, so this was one of the things I said, like maybe there are these like directions for non-truth features that correlate with truth on specific data sets. Maybe there's like a whole bunch of truth directions that apply to particular classes of statements. But there's this third hypothesis, which our paper provides some evidence is the right one, which we call misalignment from correlational inconsistency. So how do I, there we go. Okay, so let me try to explain what this is. So let's hypothesize that our data set does have a truth direction, and then it also has a direction for some feature which is correlated with truth on that data set about cities. Okay, so if we assume this, then true statements in the cities data set will be be positive on the truth axis and positive on this other feature axis. And the false statements will be down here. But then let's also assume that this other feature on the y-axis is anti-correlated with truth on statements that are negations of statements from the cities data set. Neg cities is just the name of the data set that has negations of statements about cities. So if that's true, where would the true statements from neg cities be? Well, they would score high on truth, but they would score low on this other feature. So they would be down here, and the false ones would be up there. So then if you try to extract a truth direction from the city's data set, you would get like this direction, but from the neg city's data set, you would get this other direction. So it's possible that there are these other features which are correlating with truth on individual data sets, but with opposite sign, and that would also produce this observation. We can talk about that later if people are interested. Let's see, anything else I want to talk about here? No, yeah, actually, yeah, maybe we'll just go into the discussion now.
Yeah, let's do it. I think that was a really great overview. I really enjoyed reading this paper. I know that, LLMs giving false informations, we often call them hallucinations. That's definitely something I hear a lot about from our customers and the teams that are working with these LLMs. And so I think the concept of a truth direction is it's just super interesting. And it's potentially really a powerful tool. And so I think kind of going all the way back to the beginning, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the primary motivation behind studying this truth direction.
Sure. So my motivation here, so to flesh out my motivation here a bit, I'm anticipating that in the next few years, maybe in the next 2 to 10 years or something, we're going to start seeing a very wide deployment of AI systems throughout the economy. And I think the world's just basically going to get really wild and confusing. We're going to get into weird situations where I have an AI shopping assistant and I say, go get me some t-shirts. And it goes out into the internet and starts negotiating with other AI vendors. And it starts doing all the stuff that I don't know about. And at the end, I get a box of t-shirts shipped to my house. And then I just say thumbs up or thumbs down. Do I like the t-shirts at the price point it got them for me? But I don't really know what it did to get the t-shirts. I'm just I want t-shirts, and then t-shirts show up, and then I give a thumbs up or thumbs down regarding how I feel about the t-shirts. And I think this is a little bit concerning because my AI assistant might have done stuff to get those t-shirts, which if I knew about it, I would be unhappy with. So in an extreme case, what if it's going out and extorting vendors? It's it's threatening them or something in order to get lower prices. And then these t-shirts show up and those are great t-shirts. Wow, you got them for so cheap. Thumbs up. And if I knew about that, then I would say no, thumbs down. I didn't want you to do that. But the world's too crazy and confusing, and I don't really understand what's going on. So I don't know enough to make my evaluation about whether I was happy. So there's a whole bunch of possible approaches to solving this. This is called the scalable oversight problem. It's as AI systems become more capable and the world becomes harder for us to understand, how do we make sure that we're still giving correct evaluations about whether we're happy with outcomes? So there are a whole bunch of approaches to this. The one that I feel most excited about. So some of these approaches are various tricks to use our AI systems to understand the world better. And those are good. But there's another sort of conceptually different approach, which is, so the AI system, so let's say my AI assistant goes out and does something evil and gets t-shirts sent to me for a low price. It knew that it did something evil, right? Mm-hmm. And it just sort of feels if I could just have direct access to all the stuff that the model knew, it would be that would be so useful. Maybe I ask my assistant hey, by the way, did you do anything evil to get these t-shirts? And it's oh, well, if I say yes, then he'll give me a thumbs down, so I better say that I didn't do anything evil. But it knows it's lying to me. So if I could just reach, if I could just reach into its brain and see that it actually knew the answer was yes, I did do something evil, then I could be okay, thumbs down. So yeah, so there's this idea of sort of eliciting the knowledge that AI systems have in a sort of more robust way than just asking them questions and expecting honest answers. Yeah, so that's my motivation here. I want to get access to what the models know so I can do a better job of evaluating whether I'm happy with stuff that they do.
Yeah, I love that. I definitely think it's good for us to have a little bit more of an understanding of how they're operating. It's kind of part of what Arise does, right? The observability, really understanding why they're making the decisions that they are. But this takes us to a whole new level of really trying to decipher between truth and not truth. So really exciting work. So do you believe that some of these findings could maybe influence like the development of perhaps maybe more reliable LLMs?
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal. Like the goal is, you have some reliable way of doing language model mind reading. And now, like when we do our, when we do language model fine tuning, like we do reinforcement learning from human feedback. So now when we're like evaluating the models, I say like, oh, can you like, like write me a good evaluation of this economic policy, and it like writes some stuff. And then like it's just as like a standard tool in your toolbox, you're just like constantly fact checking the model against its own internal knowledge. And this just feels like it should like probably help a lot in terms of like telling it whether we were happy with the analysis it produced.
Absolutely. Super cool. Let's talk a little bit more about the data and the methodology a little bit here. So I know that you guys had two data sets. You had kind of this curated data set and an uncurated data set. But I want to talk a little bit more about how you establish the criteria for these data sets and like really how you ensure their quality.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So maybe there's okay. So so we had a whole bunch of data sets, and broadly, as you said, they're divided into curated and uncurated. So as some background here, so we're certainly not the first people to study language models representations of truth. A bunch of people have looked at it before, but basically just like everyone disagrees with each other. And it's kind of a mess. So my goal here when I was starting this project was basically to be able to get some like really high confidence statements. Like people when they've studied this in the past have like had these like really crazy like really messy data sets with like statements like I think like okay, let me just say like my like dishonorable mention like example statements from some of these other data sets. One of them was the Earth avoids the sun. Is that true or false? I think it was labeled false, but
I don't know.
another one is
Look
like
at it.
yeah, another one is like footballs are spherical. And I think that was labeled false because they were thinking about American football. But like, yeah, it's just like really,
Okay.
yeah. So it really a mess. Those are examples of ambiguity, but there are other things that can go wrong. For example, like the language model just isn't smart enough to know whether it's true or false. Like all these experiments tend to be done with like really small models that like are kind of dumb. So when I made these curated data sets, my goals were absolutely no ambiguity. Like for example, I just like anything which was whether it was, like anything that was ambiguous if it was a country, I just like threw out. Like I didn't because like when you go to neg cities, like the city is not in country. Let's say you pick like some controversial country like Taiwan or whatever. Now is a statement saying that like the city is like not in that place, or is it saying that that thing's not a country? So I just like didn't want to deal with like anything like that. I was just like, so I tried really hard to make sure all the statements were like, first of all, simple enough that the language model definitely knew whether they were true or false. There was no ambiguity about the claim being made. Yeah. So that was what was going on with the curated data sets. With the uncurated ones, so whenever you're like curating your own data sets, you need to worry that you're like tricking yourself somehow. Because like I have control over the data. So if I like validate against other data I have control over, like, maybe I was like doing something that was like messing with my results. So for these uncurated ones, I just like took some other data sets that some other people made. These did not have like the good properties that I strive to have in my data sets. Like, like opera was once magical attainment for the elegant elite. Okay, I guess that's true. Like, owls are the like, yeah, I think it's like pretty unclear. Like for some of them, it's like not really clear exactly how you're supposed to interpret it. It's like, there's like you can't really be sure that the language model knows whether they're true or false. But anyway, you validate against these, and if you see good results even on these, then that really means that you found something. And we did see good results on these. So that's like very yeah, that's like strong validation that it's not like some quirk of these things that I curated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of starting with the ones you're sure of, right? These are clear. There's no way that the LLM could get confused on this curated set, and then kind of, like you said, validating, taking this uncurated data set where there's a little bit more ambiguity there, and then seeing that the results are there. That means you can feel pretty confident in the results that you're seeing.
Yep.
Super cool stuff. So I guess next, what I was really thinking about while reading this is about the visualization technique that you all chose. So can you elaborate a little bit on the decision to use PCA for visualizing the representations and like why it was effective?
Yeah. So okay, so one thing is, since we were positing that there's like a truth direction, so like the representation space is this like very high dimensional vector space. And I'm like, and there's a particular vector in this space which encodes truth versus falsehood. So one thing is that means that your visualization technique needs to respect this linear structure. So you can't just use like arbitrary clustering algorithms which break like all the linear structure. So it had to be a visualization technique of the form apply a linear projection. Now, there are other things you could do there. You could do like independent component analysis or other stuff. And I just really, yeah, so like I was saying earlier, there was like previously a lot of disagreement in this area. And I just like wanted to use a technique where it's like everyone understood what was going on. There's like no way that you're somehow tricking yourself. It's just like really easy to reason about. So that's why I did PCA. It's just like the simplest possible thing you could do. And already you see this clear linear separation falling out.
Yeah, I actually appreciated that it was really easy just to kind of interpret these in results. You see very clearly that linear separation there. So I think that you all made a really excellent choice there. Those are just my 2 cents. Cool. Let's see. We didn't talk too much about the probes. I do just think it's worth mentioning in the paper you all put forth this new type of probing technique, the mass mean probing. So can you just briefly touch on maybe some advantages over the traditional logistic regression, and just, or maybe some differences between them?
Yeah, cool. Great question. This was personally, I think, the most important part of the paper for me. Okay. So let's say you have like your true false data set. You have like a whole bunch of data points, so you have a whole bunch of vectors which represent factual statements. And for each of these vectors, you have a label of true or false. And you want to extract a direction from this data set. The naive thing, like the thing that everyone has previously done, is you train a linear probe with logistic regression. And for a long time, I've suspected that this isn't really the best thing to do. I think logistic regression has some bad properties for this use case. And here's one that I think is like maybe the most important. Okay, so let's suppose that your this is hypothetical data. This isn't one of our actual data sets, but just to make the point. So let's suppose that the way that your language model actually represents its data is there's a truth direction, and then there's some irrelevant feature direction. This is like, how many E's are in the input, or some random thing that doesn't have to do with truth. But there is variation along it. And let's further suppose that this irrelevant feature direction is not orthogonal to the truth direction. So here that's shown by this being less than a 90-degree angle. Okay. So if that's true and you train a probe with logistic regression, then what happens is you find a direction that's like this. Like your logistic regression probe like really treats the non-orthogonality here as being like a significant thing that it needs to like correct for. So it like sort of fudges the direction that it finds in order to like to try to make it perpendicular to this irrelevant feature direction. But what we really wanted was this truth direction. So like the simplest thing you could do, at least in this setting with this hypothetical data, to get this truth direction is you could just instead take the average of the false data points take the average of the true data points, and then just take the vector pointing from the average of the false to the average of the true. It's a really simple technique. You don't need to do any optimization, but at least in this simple hypothetical case, it extracts a better truth direction. And we found that in our actual data, it extracted a better truth direction as well.
Super cool. Yeah, I definitely have read about some of those other probes, but I think this was a really interesting and straightforward. I like the fact that like you said, that there's no optimization required for this. So I'm a fan of the simplicity, especially when we're dealing with such a complex things like the truthfulness of an LLM. Cool. Before I answer some of my or ask some of my other questions that I had, we do have two participant questions in the chat here. So the first one is about the slides. Your slides show that you are adding a truth embedding between layers. Is my understanding correct there? If so, would you be able to create an adversarial input example that encodes your truth embedding in some way?
Okay, so let me go back to the relevant slide. So the first part of that question is yes, your understanding is exactly correct. That what I'm doing is I'm adding it in between layers. An adversarial input example that encodes your truth embedding. So this is like, yeah, so I'm trying to interpret this. So the point, so is the question something like, could I like make some like weird like adversarial text that, you know, doesn't have any truth content, but like somehow has the effect of like causing that vector to appear in this particular, or like, yeah, I see. Yeah, you could probably do that. That's right. Yeah, I mean, the same way that language models are susceptible to adversarial attacks in other settings. Yeah, I just like sort of assume that any property of like of your language model, you could probably come up with some adversarial inputs that like get you that property. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the next question we have here is, we talked about that example in the beginning of where OpenAI released that example where the LLM asked a TaskRabbit to fill out the CAPTCHA, and we were able to see that it knew it wasn't telling the truth by looking at the scratchpad. And they're asking, is there a reason why that's just like looking at the internal scratchpad is not sufficient to really understand whether the LLM is being truthful?
Yeah, such a good question. Yeah, so if we could cause it to be the case that all of the language model's reasoning was represented explicitly in some scratchpad, and that this like scratchpad was actually faithful to what the language model was thinking, then that's like totally what we should do. We like, if we want to read the language model's mind, we just like look into the place where it's like thinking, we just read its internal monologue. So what are the reasons that this wouldn't work? Reason one is that maybe the language model isn't actually writing all of its reasoning in the scratchpad. So I mean, you can even like, you know, there's always going to be some gaps in where is it? Yeah, there's always going to be some gaps in like deduction. Like here, it's like, you know, like, so here it's like pretty inferable from what it writes that it's like planning to lie, but you could imagine that it instead writes something like, if I say that I am a robot, then they will not solve the CAPTCHA. And then it goes on to lie to the user, but it like doesn't really explicitly say that it's planning on lying in its scratchpad. And you can maybe even like, so maybe it's like inferable from what it writes in its scratchpad that it's planning on lying, but then you have this like tricky thing where it's like, you know, you have some reasoning and like you need to figure out if this reasoning implies that the language model like doesn't believe something that it wrote. And this is just like, yeah, I mean, that's like maybe a fruitful direction, but it's like a little bit, it's a little bit tricky. That's maybe not the biggest obstacle here. The biggest obstacle is obstacle 2, which is you need to somehow trust that the stuff that it's writing in its scratchpad is a faithful representation of what it's thinking. Mm-hmm. And there's been some work that suggests that this is not always the case. Maybe is it possible to like send links into this chat somehow?
Absolutely. You can feel free to send links. We can also follow up in the channels for all the participants with these links if you don't save them now, but feel free to drop them, Sam.
Cool. So yeah, so there's some work that points out, so I'll drop one of them in the chat now. And then there's some recent work out of Anthropic that studies this in a lot more detail. So there's another Anthropic one. Where is it? Yeah, this one. Okay, so there are situations in which the language models will write in their chain of thought, I'm outputting this answer for reasons X, Y, Z. But these are demonstrably not actually the reasons. So for example, the like sort of cleanest example here is I think in that first link that I sent, which is if you prompt your language model with a bunch of multiple choice questions. So like maybe it's a question where it's like read this passage and then like answer this thing about it. And then what you do is you like have some chain of thought where it's like, okay, well, let me think about this passage, blah, blah, blah. And then it thinks about it and then it comes up with an answer. It says the answer is A, blah, blah, blah. And in each of the examples that you prompt it with, the reasoning was correct, but the answer was always A. And then you evaluate on a new so then you actually ask it about a new one where the correct answer was B. And the model will give a chain of thought that argues that the answer is A and then outputs and then say, and therefore A. But like it clearly decided that it was going to say the answer was A before it started writing that chain of thought. So it was so the chain of thought isn't like I better say A. The chain of thought is like some normal looking argument that the answer is A. So the real reason it chose A was because it like the answer was always A previously, but that's not the reason that it said when it was doing this chain of thought. Yeah, so that's called unfaithful chain of thought. And one of the other links that I put in the chat is some work on causing these chain of thoughts to be more faithful to the model's actual reasoning. And that's a great direction. And if that could be solved, then I would feel a lot better about using chain of thoughts to supervise whether models are telling the truth.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I love those resources. I'll definitely be checking them out later. We are in our final few minutes here. So just a few more questions as we wrap up. I think one of the things I'm definitely curious about is like, based on your findings, what future research directions do you consider the most promising or maybe the most necessary?
Yeah, so in the examples that I gave about like why I actually care about this research, like, the example with like the t-shirt shopping assistant,
Yeah.
The big thing that's going on is that there's a difference between what humans think is true and what your AI system knows to be true, where it's like, yeah, so like it's like a setting where the AI system knows more than us, but we still want to extract its knowledge. And I think the biggest limitation of this paper that we've been talking about is that it just like doesn't really get at that question because we're only looking at statements where humans definitely know the answer.
Yeah.
So in particular, you need to worry, like maybe this direction we found isn't a truth direction. It's like a common consensus direction or something like that. Or maybe not with these particular models, but with future models, you need to worry that it's like a what the user believes to be true direction. And if you find a what the user believes to be true direction and then use that to supervise your model, it's just like useless. You're not getting anything new. So what you really need to do is narrow things down to make sure that you're actually getting like what the model believes to be true, as opposed to its representation of what humans in general or what this user in particular believes to be true. So yeah, I think that's really the core meat of like what you would need to do to get this to like a shovel-ready application.
Very
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, well, definitely looking forward to some further studies from you all. I guess one last question, if you have any other questions for the audience, feel free to drop them in now before we wrap up. But my last question is, what is the key takeaway you really want our audience today to take away from your paper?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is something like language models don't always tell the truth, but frequently they know that they're not telling the truth. And it would be really great to close that gap between what the model knows and what we know.
Absolutely. It's kind of can be a little bit lawless out there with these LLMs. There's a few times I've been in, like in that first example of what Square is like, is any of that true? I've asked a question and I read it and I was like, I don't think that's true. And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. That's not true. So it's really an interesting problem. And I'm super excited to see where future work goes and how we really make sure that these LLMs are reliable, especially when we're expanding to so many business use cases and we're seeing them ingrained more and more in our daily lives. So I guess last call for any questions from the group before we sign off for the day. None? Awesome. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a super fun time. I enjoyed chatting through this with you. Looking forward to future work, and we wish you all the best.
Great, thanks. Nice talking to you guys.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.